Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. There was a study looking at ballerinas who were doing straddle splits on essentially like an x-ray or a radiograph, right? So they took these ballet dancers, these elite ballet dancers, and they put them on an x-ray table, and they had them do a full split to a 180-degree split. And it showed that in order for that to happen, there had to be some subluxation of the hip joint, right? So this is why Mitchell, and I think Gruer and a couple other people from the Journal of Arthroscopy in 2016, I want to say this one's from. But essentially what they did is they looked at those split radiographs, and they saw that in order to do that, you had to sublux your hip out slightly. I think it was 10, just over 10 centimeters is essentially the subluxing that was average. So while that doesn't tell us the forces of the hip joint, it does tell us that to get to these end ranges and do these skills, it's a lot of stress on the hip joint to move those joint capsules up and down and cause that. So again, you can pull out these pieces of information, right, and understand that, okay, if a regular oversplit or just a regular split causes this micro subluxation, and we've also seen this in other x-rays from gymnasts doing oversplits, getting x-rays that the front of their hip just sublux a little bit, we can probably infer that if you took those positions and dynamically swung your legs very, very hard into those positions, you'd probably be putting enormous stress on the hip joint, right? The hip joint capsule, the labrum, and the muscles around the hip. The small ones we'll talk about to stabilize the hip, like the glutes and the hip rotators and the groin. They have to be really, really strong. And also on top of that, you need to have really good overall strength of your core and of your hip, and overall strength of your lower body to handle these types of forces. Okay? Back to my first point, that gymnasts use their legs like arms. Okay, the leg and the hip joint in particular is really designed for weight bearing. It's designed for, walking around, running and jumping, right? It has this very, very deep hip socket that is made to take high forces. Now, what happens there is that because you have such a high, high congruency of deep hip socket, you don't have that flexibility available. So it's good and it's bad, right? It's good because we want that stability. We want that ability to walk and run and do the things that we do upright. But in a sport like gymnastics that wants very extreme jumps and leaps and flexibility demands and very aggressive in-bar skills like stalders or endos or pancakes, it's going to make it very challenging for this hip joint to get into those positions. So some athletes, they are born with, good luck where they have some hypermobility. They also have some bone structure that allows them to do these positions, and they have really good soft tissue flexibility. They're probably going to have an easier time getting into those positions. It's probably why they're so good at gymnastics. A natural selection type point of view allowed them to do basics and skills when they were younger that people said that, oh, wow, you're kind of naturally flexible. Let's keep doing gymnastics. Okay. Vice versa. Those who do not inherently have that bony structure and that hypermobility, they're probably not going to do well with these extreme ranges of motion. It's not to say they can't do gymnastics, but it's just to say that we have to appreciate that there are many different types of body types and different types of body profiles and hip joints that can do different skills. You might not be the most super hypermobile ballet flexible dancer in the world. There's many other power-based skills that you can do to try to get those requirements and try to get to the sport successfully. So we have to know that inherently the hip joint is not built for this mobility. It does have more stability, but we can tailor our adjustments and tailor our training programs based on what the athletes in front of us need. In order to actually change that muscle yourself, you probably need to actually do some loaded work. You need to do some evidence-based eccentrics, strength and conditioning, some things that help load the area and cause that true length over time and cause you to use that range of motion so that your body hangs on to it a little bit, right? There's the structural point of view. You could argue like, okay, we're actually getting length and time. Like eccentrics promote what's called sarcomerogenesis sometimes, which allows muscles to truly get longer. But you can also make the argument that maybe your body is neurologically going to use the range of motion and keep the range of motion if you consistently do it, right? If you always, squat to a certain depth or do splits to a certain length, your body's going to keep understanding, oh yeah, this is how far we go. This is how far we go. Okay. That probably will change things structurally over time, more so than just passive stretching. So all these things kind of come together just to kind of summarize that there's a lot of great science out there, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years that has come out. And I really feel as though we have to do a better job of incorporating it into the day-to-day training, particularly as it relates to, hip flexibility, quads, hip flexors, groins, splits, jumps, leaps. Active flexibility is great. I believe we should be stretching every day in a warm-up dynamic and a little bit of static stretching here as the research supports it. But it's more about a holistic view based on what all of the research says. The research supports soft tissue work. It supports some regular stretching, right? Specific muscle-based stretching based on the anatomy, right? It supports eccentrics. It supports strength conditioning programs. These are the things we want to be using consistently to really make sure we're getting the best of that muscle specific stretching. We want to bias the muscles because the joint capsules probably are already a little loose jointed. So that being said, on that, it's really important to study the anatomy, as we'll talk about, because the anatomy dictates what types of stretching are the most effective, right? Like that deep hip flexor lunge that we see also commonly everywhere. Yes, it's aesthetically pleasing and it has a time and it has a place. And I want people to know I encourage those things to be done like in dance circuits. But if you have somebody with a very, very stiff hip joint and you're trying to get them more mobile, doing that deep overarched back position where the hip flexor actually starts at the spine, if you understand the anatomy, we're probably not getting the most out of that stretch for the hip flexor. But I really believe that the future of gymnastics is this hybrid model. So things like split squats and single leg RDLs and proper squatting and hinging patterns, not only will they double down and help some of these flexibility things, they're also going to protect the hip joints against these high forces, right? And often, almost times when I bring this up, people instantly think about football programs. They think about benching 315 pounds. They think about doing, bicep curls and super, super heavy squats, right? That's really not what we're going for when we want a gymnast to weight train. We're talking about very specific sports performance programs, right? And we have a lot of great podcasts and blogs on this, but we're talking about very specific exercises that will complement the gymnastics training, right? And the perfect one I always give is something like a rear foot elevated and a front foot elevated split squat. So split squat is kind of like a lunge and you slowly lower down and lower up, but we can give somebody, a gymnast, bilaterally elevated split squats with a nice slow 3-second tempo and a 3-second pause. That is really going to help develop the flexibility into that split position. It's also going to build that protective end range, right? We're going to get that athlete down to end range and we're going to work on holding and pausing to build the strength to do that later in a switch leap or later when they're sprinting or running and load the hamstring. If we take that and we complement it with something like a slider split eccentric, right? Hands on block, slowly down in the slider. Between the two of those things, we're building up some great capacity of the hamstring to handle that end range force and of the back leg's hip joint and hip flexor to control that motion, right? So instead of just throwing switch leap drills at them, we can build up their foundational capacity with this nice hybrid-based strength conditioning. So labrum is essentially this fibrocartilage tissue that helps to kind of line the inner socket and it deepens the socket, but it also provides a vacuum seal and more stability. Okay. So it really helps to kind of suck the ball of the head in there and keep it nice and secure. It's very, very important for many things. Okay. So one, is it helps increase the acetabular volume and it helps increase the acetabular contact. It helps spread force out across the hip joint, right? Really, really high forces coming through the hip joint, right? With walking and running and jumping and sprinting. So if we just had like the bone on the bone to cartilage, it might be too much and there might not be enough shock absorption. Similar to how we have like a meniscus in the knee, which is also a fibrocartilage structure. This is a horseshoe shaped structure that has a good thickness of 3 to 8 millimeters and 5 millimeters and some really broad width up to 8 millimeters. It's going to allow us to take those high forces of impact and move the hip joint around without having any wear and tear, so to speak. Okay. So it kind of acts as that buffer, but it also acts as a really important seal of like an intra-articular pressure is maintained, which means that it allows a lot more, force distribution. And also it really helps to keep that suction going. If we didn't have that suction, there's a lot more sliding of the hip joint all around. And that is what happens with micro instability. If we have a labral tear or we have some hypermobility plus some damage, it's very easy for the hip joint to start sliding around way more at those extreme ranges of motion. When you extend your leg all the way back, if those bones run out of room and that femoral head is sliding forward and you have a labral tear and you don't have this vacuum seal, you're probably going to get more motion of the femoral head and that can cause some hip flexor strain, some groin strain, some labral damage. And this is a really common mechanism we see in gymnastics, is extreme end ranges of high force, like I talked about, causing the labrum to become irritated over time. Okay. So we need this labrum to really protect against some of these things. It's really, really important to buffer and transfer load. It maintains that vacuum seal. And there was a great paper from Shu that showed that a loss of that suction seal, it needs about 60% less force to distract the hip. So if we lose that seal, it's quite a bit easier to distract the hip, which means slide the hip around a little bit. And again, that might start to beat up some of the soft tissue, some of the joints, some of the cartilage, stuff like that. The labrum itself can become more irritable. The outside of the hip joint has some very, very important muscles that are crucial for jumps, leaps, sprinting, landing, in bars, right? These muscles that literally rotate the hips through, do that swim through motion or do that kind of pulling and pushing motion in jumps and leaps. I think oftentimes we really undertrain them quite a bit in gymnastics, right? So we have the glute medius and the glute minimus, right, which are on the outside of the hip joint here. So one, they bring the leg out to the side, right, for a straddle jump, but they also are pretty much the main stabilizer of landing on one leg. So if you don't want to fall off beam, right, you need to have a very, very strong outer hip muscles. But sometimes when you land on one leg, if you're not strong enough, the hip can drop down and you can actually cause some pinching of the groin in this kind of compression of these two bones together. So it's very important for gymnasts to have very, very strong outer hip muscles to perform well, to sprint, right? Sprinting on one leg requires an enormous amount of outer hip strength to kind of balance that side to side motion as you're trying to run straight ahead. If you have really not developed outer hips, it's really hard for your hamstrings and your quads and your glutes to make you run really, really fast. So I've seen some athletes that have enormously strong quads, glutes, hamstrings, but they don't have any strength on the outside of the leg, and they kind of wobble back and forth when they run. They can't produce the power they need for their really, really good vault sprints. When we build this return to sport phase, right, we're going to try to make sure that we have a nice slow dosage of gymnastics specific surfaces and skills. The three things we're going to modify and use as our variables will be the surface that they're on. Okay. So tumble track versus rod strip versus floor, the amount of force that is going through their hip per skill. So basics on bars versus, swinging on bars versus, kipping on bars versus stallers and in bars have a very linear increase in force based on drills to higher skills. And then also repetitions, which is kind of the easiest one, which is how many are you doing per day, per week, per month. So we're going to start with 3 days per week, usually, right? I'm usually going to build in their home program into these events so that they're not doing every event every day. In the first 2 weeks, we're going to start with softer surfaces only. So drills, tumble track, very, very easy surfaces for their hip. And we're going to do very, very basic skills. So drills, like I said, in low repetition. So I can't give you an exact number, but it's generally between like 3 to 5 of each skill that I try to start with. And we're doing this every other day. So it might be on tumble track for a little bit. It might be doing some basics on tumble track, some basics on bars, some basic cartwheel step-ins, jumping on the trampoline. We would do that every other day for 2 weeks and make sure no symptoms increase. Because in my experience, the symptoms are typically not during their activity. It's the day after or 2 days after. So we want to give them a buffer in between to make sure it's not too sore, right? After those 2 weeks go well, we would then increase the surfaces, right? We'd increase maybe a rod strip. We would start going on the actual hard beam versus the floor line. We would try to make sure we're doing actual, landings on 8 inches on softer surfaces and not the hard ground, but it's not the pit. Okay. We would do harder surfaces. We would start to increase the difficulty of those skills. So maybe they're running into a round off whip on vault instead of doing a Yurchenko or just doing drills. Maybe now they're doing metal bar stoop stallers underneath. Maybe they're doing some jumps and leaps on beam that are about half their full percentage of their kicking, but they're not doing their full skills. Okay. We would do moderate volume. So maybe 5 to 7 now, instead of just 3 to 5. We would do that for 2 weeks as well. And then lastly, the 5 to 6 weeks, we would start going harder surfaces. Maybe we do the harder skills on tumble track and the basic skills on floor. So maybe they do their fulls and double backs on tumble track, but they do their layouts and their front tumbling and their front layouts and bounding on floor to mix it up back and forth, right? The skills themselves are harder because we're doing more advanced stuff, and the volume itself stays about the same because of the other two variables being really, really heavy. So harder surfaces, harder skills, but maybe keep the volume the same so we're not pushing things too fast, too soon. And then lastly, the 7 to 8 week mark, I usually have people say, okay, you can do whatever you want, but no more than 7 of any one skill at a particular time, just to kind of rein in the cap a little bit there. So what can we do if we want to speed things up a little bit? I understand I have to rest, all that kind of stuff, but what can I do? And I think these are oftentimes underlooked. Okay. So number one is sleep. I think that people don't realize that you have to have a good high quality of sleep. Kids probably need 8+ hours of high quality sleep per night. So if somebody really wants to maximize how fast their hip gets better and how fast they heal, no magic pills, no magic buttons. But if you can have someone consistently try to, get to sleep at the same time, have a nice cool room around 68 degrees, try to avoid any screens or blue light for an hour before bed. If they're drinking coffee, cut the coffee off 10 hours before bed. Try to not eat too much before they go to sleep because your stomach will have digestion issues. And then maybe in the morning, start to see some morning sunlight, and the evening, see some evening sunlight setting. Those things all have been supported by really good research to set your circadian rhythm and give you really high quality of sleep. So that's really important. Proper fueling, proper nutrition is crucial here, right? I think, unfortunately, sometimes people think like, oh, I'm not working out, so I'm not going to have as much to eat. But your body's healing. And if you're doing the right thing in strength and conditioning and in sports performance, you should be working your tail off in PT. You should be working your tail off in the gym to do what you can around your hip injury. So I am not a nutritionist. I'm not an expert there, but there are many phenomenal people out there Christina Anderson, Carrie Blair, Josh Eldridge. There's tons of great people to talk about nutrition, not only in general, but nutrition as it relates to injuries and recovery. So I think that also would be really, really helpful. So another thing that's important to speed up healing is to stay moving, right? Don't just lay there and kind of wait for it to heal. Try to do what you can. Try to walk, try to be upright, try to do things that are getting you active, gets the blood pumping, get your body going a little bit, right? Rather just sitting there and waiting for it to heal. Obviously, for like 2 weeks after surgery, you have to do that to respect the healing timeline. But for most people, you can be up, you can be doing stuff, you can be on top of stuff.